As long as it's long.
I went to go find one yesterday, but I wasn't able to with the 18 runway.
Oh, it's great.
So,
I love it.
actually, I was getting two.
Today, it's an honor to be with you here at the World Affairs Council and all of the high school students in attendance. Brings me back to the days when I was in high school, and I was the high school announcer for my entire career in high school for the full 3 years, I guess it was, when I started every day with the pledge to the flag. If there was a flag here, we'd all rise and we would join in the pledge to the flag. So it's wonderful to be with you, and I'm very excited for you. We're going to have a very interesting and stimulating program here today to talk about journalism, free speech, the First Amendment, and the whole works. And we have some very, very impressive panelists here today. First of all, let me introduce our distinguished panel. Professor Christina Bellantoni is a professor and director of USC Annenberg's Media Center, which is close by here on the USC campus. She's also a columnist for Roll Call, also faculty fellow at the Annenberg Center, and serves on the boards of the Riverside Record and Hunter Index. Strong journalism background, to say the least. She's covered government and presidential campaigns, was assistant managing editor for politics at the LA Times, and previously served as editor-in-chief of Roll Call. A Harvard Kennedy School fellow, she frequently appears on the major networks and has worked as a digital strategy consultant for the 19th News. Please welcome Professor Christina Bellantoni. Also with us is Professor Henry C.J. Jackson. C.J., a seasoned writer and communications expert teaching at the USC Annenberg Center since 2016. He was director of editorial events at the LA Times until 2019 and previously worked as a staff editor at Politico during the 2016 campaign. Nearly a decade at the Associated Press, the AP covered presidential campaigns and public policy, interviewing figures including President Obama and Hillary Clinton. He began his career at the Kansas City Star and is a University of Kansas graduate and Dole Fellow. Please welcome Professor Henry C.J. Jackson as we begin our discussion here on the First Amendment. For the students out there, what is the First Amendment on Super Mario's Constitution? Answer: freedom of speech. Did anybody know that? We'll have some moments of levity here as we go along. Well, thank you very much, panel. We're going to sit down now and start the program. First of all, First Amendment, very important to our profession, journalism. And let me start with you, Professor Bellantoni. Maybe tell us a bit more about your background and as we set the stage here for our discussion on the First Amendment.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here on a Friday. Really like seeing all of these high school students who I'm sure worked very hard to be here. And I love that you're interested in these topics, which I find to be some of the most important that we can have. When I was your age, I grew up in San Jose, California. I knew I wanted to be a writer, but I never kind of envisioned that I would ultimately be, talking to presidents or working in the halls of Congress or on television talking about some of the most important issues of our planet. And the idea that that dream is possible for somebody who, was the child of a single mom, grew up poor, managed to figure it all out is still something that I'm proud of and I try to instill in my students at USC today. And that's just it. I wrote a lot and I read a lot. And that was kind of the foundations that helped me find journalism later. Ultimately, I realized I was never going to be a novelist. You can't really make a living that way. So I fell into journalism when I was a sophomore in college. And then I worked my way through college. I managed to start doing stories and kind of not really sure what I wanted. And then one moment crystallized everything for me. You're going to laugh because this is going to sound like such ancient history, but it was the 2000 presidential election, which was the first election I could vote in. And I watched as we went to bed not knowing who was president. And to me, that was interesting in and of itself because I was interested in government and politics, but it was like a light bulb, like that's what I want to do. And so I started asking people, what should I do? How should I pursue this dream? And I managed to find my way to Washington, D.C., and I worked really hard there, and I had a bunch of different jobs there. One wonderful day in Iowa, I got a chance to meet my friend CJ, Professor Jackson here, who you'll get to meet, getting to do the kind of thing that I felt like I still feel I was so lucky to get to do. Like, I was on a campaign bus for the guy who would end up being president. And being able to ask questions of the people who aspire to power was a privilege that I really never took for granted. And I still think it's really special that I had the opportunity to do that. And I also take it really seriously. And it gets us back to what the topic is. What is truth? How do you share truth? How does your audience start to trust you that what you see and you're relaying to them in whatever platform that may be, whether that's a TikTok in your hand or a magazine article that you're holding, what are those underpinnings of truth and how do you build and maintain that trust? And that's pretty much what I've tried to do through my whole career. You've heard all the different bios. Happy to talk to anybody and answer any questions. I'm not shy. I love talking about how I got into this, what I learned along the way, mistakes I made. That's always the most interesting class I ever teach, is talking about all my mistakes. Students like to hear that. And then also happy to talk to you about USC if you have any interest, and just getting experience in journalism, which I had to push it away from me so I don't irradiate it. But my phone, I was going to hold it up and say, you can be a journalist with that device. You don't need anything else other than a curious mind, the ability to communicate, whether that's through written word or talking or in a podcast. That's something that has been a great equalizer just in the times of our careers.
First of all, thank you guys. I have a son who's in 8th grade, and I told him I was talking to high school students today. And in a very 8th grade way, he goes, "Why? Like, why do they want to hear from you?" So I'm grateful for all of your patience already. I got into journalism kind of in a backwards way. My parents were both journalists. My dad was an editor at a newspaper called the Wall Street Journal, and my mom was in journalism, but she was and then went into corporate communications. And both of them worked really hard. And for me, it was like a profession where my parents were away at night or late getting home for dinner or something. And I was like, I don't want to go into journalism. It seems like they're always busy. Then when I was a teenager, my mom got sick and ultimately passed away. And I read her obituary in the newspaper. Reporter from the newspaper my dad worked at talked to me about my mom, and I read it. And really, it was one of these moments where you can kind of see your career open up in front of you. Because I just saw my story and my mom's story put in a way where like the whole world could understand it. And it really unlocked kind of the power of the profession. So for me, journalism and the First Amendment has always first and foremost been about being able to use your voice or help someone else find their voice and kind of like put that out there to the world. I didn't start out wanting to be a political journalist. I actually wanted to be a sports reporter. I got a scholarship to the University of Kansas, which has an excellent basketball team and a better basketball team than USC. I'm obliged to point out. Many more national champions, anyway, in that particular sport. And started covering basketball there. But one of the things you learn about work and life is that sometimes things you love shouldn't be your profession, and sometimes things you love should be your profession. Covered the basketball team, had friends that I covered, and then went on to play in the NBA. But I didn't really like being combative with them. If you're talking to a future NBA point guard or something, you don't really want to argue with him about his point of view or test his mettle the same way you do people who are really making decisions that will shape public policy, your city's priorities, or anything like that. So I found my way into political journalism, and then ultimately worked my way up at news organizations, kind of covering issues that mattered to me as opposed to things that entertained me. But both of them are really interesting ways to kind of pursue a career. And ultimately, that led me all the way here to LA, where I teach journalism at USC and also do a lot of journalism day to day. So it's just me.
Let me just mention this, that the way I got started in this business was not something that I originally thought I would be doing. I know we have a number of science students here, and that's what I was interested in at the beginning. I was very much into medicine and science, and was planning to become a doctor, was actually the president of the Future Doctors in high school. And just for fun, as I mentioned earlier, did some announcing, and ultimately my interest shifted when I had the chance to work at a radio station at the age of 16 while I was in high school, and had the chance to work at a big FM station in the Miami area, sort of like a KISS FM kind of a station. And a big difference between an emergency room and a radio station, folks, I have to say. So kind of gravitated to that and had the chance to do the news there early on, and kind of learned it by doing. And you talk about making mistakes, and when you're on the air pronouncing things, right away you hear about it. It's not Greenwich Village, Frank. It's Greenwich Village, or stuff like that. You're instantly corrected. It's not Iran. It's Iran. So all these very nuanced pronunciations have to be accurate. So it was learning under those circumstances. So at that point in high school, my interest shifted, and I decided that I was going to stick with broadcasting, and ultimately went with the all-news station in Miami, the CBS all-news station there. The science background was helpful because ultimately I was asked to do all the space shuttle launches for the CBS radio network, also at a relatively young age. So that's why certainly when I speak to a group like this, encourage you to start as early as you can. When the news director of the network found out that I was 23 at the time, he said, "Well, he doesn't sound 23." And that was the end of that. So start as early as you can. That's certainly what I did. And didn't go the traditional educational route either. Worked full-time and went to school part-time. Ultimately, when I came here to Los Angeles 30-some-odd years ago, I had the chance to connect with Jeff Baum and some other folks here at USC at the time, Dean Cowan and so forth. And they asked me to create and teach the news radio course, which I did for 10 years here on the USC campus. So it's been a wonderful experience working in both radio and television for many, many years. And certainly, as we've noted at other journalism forums, the state of journalism is very much in question, but the news business is really quite booming. But ultimately, quality journalism will prevail, as it always has. So if anything, we should be optimistic about coming away from this conversation here today. So with that, obviously, knowing what to do on the air is very important, and how to comport yourself with proper journalistic ethics, and knowing what the First Amendment is. And in fact, I think it'd be wise to mention what is the First Amendment right off the bat here, so we know what we're talking about. So the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution protects 5 fundamental freedoms: religion, speech, the press, peaceful assembly, and the right to petition the government, preventing Congress from establishing a religion, prohibiting free religious practice, or restricting expression, assembly, or petition. It ensures citizens can believe what they want, speak freely, even unpopular ideas, publish opinions, gather peacefully, and complain to their government, though these rights are against government action, not private entities. So some of the freedoms that are protected here: religion prevents the government establishment of religion and protects an individual's right to practice their faith. It guards the media's ability to publish information and opinions without government censorship. It guarantees the right to gather peacefully with others and allows citizens to ask the government to correct wrongs or change policies. So as far as government action is concerned, it primarily protects actions intended to convey a message, like wearing armbands. That was a case that came up in the 1960s when some students wore black armbands to protest the Vietnam War, and the Supreme Court got involved with that one. Rights are not absolute. They can be limited in cases of immediate threats or public safety concerns. So, Professor Bellantoni, give us your thoughts here on the scope of the First Amendment as it pertains to free speech these days.
The good news is that even while we see so much coming from Washington that is affecting the media, we are still a nation where we can get the truth to the people, right? It comes in a lot of different forms, and there are a lot of challenges right now. And I think I'm actually curious, CJ's perspective, we haven't actually ever talked about this, about who is allowed inside the Oval Office of the White House, for example. So President Trump takes his second oath of office. He's now president. He gets into sort of a dispute with the Associated Press over the naming of the Gulf of Mexico, among other things, and ultimately says, you're not going to be allowed to come into the Oval Office. And to me, it's fascinating, but it is also not a First Amendment right for the AP to be in that physical space. It's already a space that is limited by size and the number of humans that can be inside it. And this can get very boring very fast, but the short version is that it's like a rotating basis of journalists who work at the White House who get to be in these spaces, right? If you see something from Air Force One, there's only a handful of people there. CJ's, I'm sure, flown on it many times, maybe. I have never been on it, by the way. But, the AP is like one of the organizations that traditionally has been on it or has been in the Oval Office. But Trump has the right to kick them out. Now, he doesn't have the right to censor them, as you're reading, the specifics of what the First Amendment protects, or in the case of the Pentagon, saying that we would only credential reporters to be physically in the building who would agree to not use anonymous sources for their reporting about matters of war and defense and really big picture things, right? And basically the entire Pentagon press corps said a big middle finger and they walked out and they said, we're not going to do that. Again, these are all things they're still doing their job. And actually, it's better not to report from within the building anyway. You're trying to get sources elsewhere. You can still be an amazing Department of Defense reporter without physically being in the building. It's, questions of access and everything else. So it's threatened. And I think this is a time where it's never been more important to pay attention and to think about who you're listening to, where you are getting information. Are you confident that information is real? Those are all things that present a threat and are challenging, but we've got a strong First Amendment. And the last thing I'll say on this is I teach at USC where we have a huge number of international students. 20% of our student body comes from another country. And the ones that come to us and want to be journalists, many of them are coming from countries where they cannot report freely. Right? They cannot go home and get a journalism job, in several of these countries where many of them come to us from, the same way that you could do if you're from England or Spain. You are not going to be able to report freely. And to me, it makes me more and more grateful for the First Amendment every day of what we're able to have here and offer for people from elsewhere.
Yeah, I think one thing I think about with the First Amendment, the current state of it is it's vibrant and maybe a little too vibrant. One of the things that's going on in our current media ecosystem is that we have more voices than ever before. And there are obviously huge pluses and huge minuses to that. Gets to the issue that Christina is talking about, which is ultimately credibility and journalistic values. Every day I see kind of the media diet that I take in versus what some of my students take in, or even my son. His media diet's a little weird because he's into Marvel movies and very specific things. But even the credibility of the journalists, and I'll put them in air quotes, that he is taking in content from is very different than what it was in my childhood. And I think that is a sign of the strength of the First Amendment, in the sense that we have changes in technology, amount of different media platforms and different things that are out there mean that lots of different people can create. Not all of them take seriously, I think, the journalistic mantle that Christina and I try to teach every day at USC, or that your teachers might expect from you if you're working in student media. But it's a sign of strength that we have that many voices, even if a lot of them are full of baloney.
Excellent points. We'll continue the conversation here now. Given the situation politically, everything's very politically charged. In the olden days, you used to be able to listen to one station and get different views. Nowadays, you have to go from one station to another to kind of get a balanced view. Is this a big topic of discussion there, Professor Bellantoni at the USC Annenberg School for Communication, as far as sifting through the political landscape and ultimately getting the best information?
Yeah, we require our students to have a healthy media diet and also know the reality that in many cases, students are getting information off their phones, in many cases from video, and you might not even know the actual named news outlet where it's coming from, if it's coming from one at all, right? You might follow a person who has a take on the news. It doesn't mean you're not getting factual information. It doesn't mean you are getting factual information, but kind of being able to be a healthy media consumer is part of this deal, I feel like. And we talk about that a lot with our students, particularly because we're a school of communication, journalism, and public relations. The skill sets are all very interrelated. You learn one side of it, you can do one of the other things. And so we end up seeing a lot of that. Students who are studying journalism go into PR. PR students are reporting on our television news, that kind of a thing. But to me, what I try to tell them is that you should build up people that you trust. And how do you determine whether you can trust them or not? In some cases, I like to go directly to the source of the material. I, as you can tell, very interested in politics. I will watch C-SPAN. I'm a complete nerd about this, but it is available to watch on the internet for free. And you can see what is happening in Congress, not just, where they're yelling at each other on the floor. You can watch a congressional hearing. You can see press conferences. You could watch a debate between two congressional candidates in Ohio if you wanted to. And so I do a lot of encouraging people to go directly to that source and then think about it if they're covering it or they're reading material of that coverage, because in journalism, everything is a choice. The journalist, whether it's the New York Times or KTLA or Joe Bob's TikTok account, is making a choice about what to highlight. Is it the fly that landed on Mike Pence's hair, right? Arguably interesting, funny, worth a couple of memes, not the headline of a debate between him and Kamala Harris 6 years ago, almost 6 years ago. But, newsy, but not the only thing. Like somebody made a choice that they're going to lead with that, or somebody made a choice that that's the thing that then is amplified. And it does drown out some of the more substantive stuff. So the good news I always find is that people still do want substance. Google Analytics tell us that people are searching for, what is somebody's education plan, or how does somebody view the conflict in the Middle East right now? Those are all really important ways to kind of assess what people are looking for. But at the same time, if you have a story that's about the fly on somebody's head, that's what they're going to click. That's what they're going to share. And it's all very self-enforcing. So reinforcing. So I think the technology has helped, but it's also made us a little bit dumber, and all of us. And I will say, I'm the first person to defend your generation, because a lot of my colleagues really, it's the young people, like they're at fault. And I say, it's that colleague, like you might subscribe to the Wall Street Journal in your driveway. And, I still subscribe to a print newspaper, but it is all generations that consume news by the millisecond now with the swipe of your thumb and trying to get that attention. That is not a young person problem. That's just the evolution of the medium.
CJ Jackson.
Yeah, no, it's definitely not just young people. Anyone that has like my dad is old, like even older than me, 70, 74, 75. He'll sit on his phone. What? Not 6'7". No. Told my son I would get that one in. Anyway, no, and he'll sit on his phone and he thumbs the news the same way my students do. I think the important thing, like the most important value that I try to convey to my students is really this notion of like judgment and choice. The First Amendment really guarantees that thing that I was talking about. Like any highly credentialed or complete bozo can share the news with you. Your choice is whether you want to like identify with bozo's view of the news or like someone who really knows what they're talking about. And that's really like a skill set we call news judgment, and also like you can kind of discern that stuff. I would say there's like I don't want to. Christina and I would both pay for the premium plan if it existed for C-SPAN. To be clear, like we're certified dorks, but like there's a lot of value for young people in consuming traditional media. You learn a lot. It exposes you to ideas you might not have. I had an experience at USC. I have one of my students is a football player, like the starting left tackle for the USC football team. And I was like, we had a news quiz and he didn't do well. And I was like, Elijah, you have to read the New York Times. That's like what this question is. And he's like, I don't know, like it's a free subscription that USC provides, so no money out the door. And then I was like, and you get a free subscription to The Athletic with this. And he's like, his eyes lit up because he was very into sports news. The point is like spend time, understand how you can consume news. It will make you better at what you do. Yeah.
Can I add to that? Just thinking too about your initial question that we leapt off from. If you think about what's happening here in LA, for example, with immigration raids, you could get one reality of that by your news choices, right? And you can get a different reality of that by your news choices. And they can all be things that are happening, but it is a limited view or selectively chosen. And so then think about if you opened Instagram and you wanted to see with your own eyes what is happening, you could do that. And again, that puts a lot of power back in the hands of the people to be able to, again, broadcast or showcase what is going on, or take it out of the immigration raids as an example. Is the person who turned a camera on when there was an instance of police brutality that led to a man being killed, that person is a journalist, right? And suddenly it's the most important piece of media in history, because it has, inspired a movement, and it doesn't have to be somebody that has that training, that specific training. But the underpinnings of what we teach is that judgment. And then for me also, I remind people that there's not a playbook for being a journalist. It's not like being a doctor. You raise your hand and you take a Hippocratic oath, or you are a lawyer and you are a certified member of the bar. Like, there are things, but as a journalist, you can really kind of do it any way you want. Your news outlet might have some rules, and you may or may not get punished for breaking those rules depending on how good you are. And so there's a lot of nuance that we try to teach students to just understand, both if they're going to go into the profession, but also as a consumer of news.
Getting back to the First Amendment itself, a lot of people believe that freedom of speech means you can say anything you want to in any context. That is not the case with the First Amendment. It's basically says that the government cannot silence you, can't stop you from speaking, but other people can silence you, right? There are many situations where you can't express yourself the way you want to. This is something that certainly broadcasters have to keep in mind, watch their language and so forth. But what are your thoughts about that, Professor Bellantoni?
Yeah, and you all saw this in recent months with Jimmy Kimmel being taken off the air, and kind of what led to that. The government did not take Jimmy Kimmel off the air. The government, through one person, made a threat that then a corporate decision in fear of that threat was made, right? That lasted for 4 days or however long it was, with huge backlash. And suddenly this is a person who, everybody in the world knows who Jimmy Kimmel is because this was experienced. So I think that's a good way to look at it, is like individual decisions about you can attempt to silence someone. And then there's also stuff when we teach, like media law as a required course. If you come to USC and you study journalism in a master's program or an undergraduate program, you will take one semester of media law, and you will learn things that are sort of allowable in the First Amendment, and generally also how to avoid getting in trouble. So here are just a couple examples of things that my student newsroom confronts each and every day. A person filed a lawsuit making a bunch of claims against their ex-husband, and it involved USC, so it is then newsworthy. The journalist made a decision that's, newsworthy in USC, so we're going to write about this. And in that story, the journalist cited the lawsuit. According to the lawsuit, so-and-so did this. The lawsuit claims such and such happened, right? And then the wife of the person being sued called me and said, we're going to sue your students for libel. This is defamation. Two different things, by the way. And this is what she says to me. And I said, first of all, you have no grounds. This is garbage. I was actually quite polite to her at first, but she was mean to my students, so I took a little bit firm. But if the students are carefully reporting what is in the lawsuit and attributing that information to the lawsuit, you're not saying this happened. You're not saying person did this to this person. You're saying this person is charging in a lawsuit that this person did this to this person. Now, the judgment of should you cover that at all, because anybody can file a lawsuit, and people lie in lawsuits. People lie all kinds of times. People can say, I saw so-and-so do this and they didn't do it. These are all judgments and a reporting process that you want a journalist to go through, or a TikTok media influencer too, right? You have to always assess, like, why are you getting information, or what does this person have to gain if they're giving you information? So that's all part of this too. What are you really allowed to broadcast out there? And if you're not a news outlet with a credential that can be revoked, or a broadcast license that can be, under threat, what is that obligation? I think that's where we really have a blurry line now, thinking through how you put information out there. Otherwise, are you just gossiping into a microphone?
CJ, help us understand the First Amendment and its actual application.
Yeah, I mean, I think like one of the things we didn't talk about, but I think that's interesting about the First Amendment is that in terms of silencing people, sometimes the market silences people. Christina talked a little bit about how what can happen when a very, very prominent person like the President of the United States tries to get someone off the air, but we also routinely deplatform or disregard people who say dumb things of all all spectrums of dumb, right? Like from like bad sports takes all the way to like inflammatory language around race, religion, creed, politics. I think that's like the healthy side of the First Amendment is like we often vote with our feet, or the market votes. I think the other thing I would say on that I see a lot with my son's own media consumption. He's not on TikTok so much because I won't let him put it on his phone, but he does YouTube shorts, and he'll often be like, I really want like this pair of sneakers, or like something, like some very materialistic thing. And it's because some YouTuber he's watched is being paid by some sneaker company or some other type of company to like pitch this product. And they're doing it in a way that is very, like obvious to my naked eye, but less obvious to his eye. And I think these are sort of the things that when I think about journalism and the First Amendment, one of the things that I really appreciate about being a journalist is like a kind of code of conduct where if you are going to be having a conflict of interest or creating type of content where you mention something or beliefs or something that you want people to buy, Christina and I would never work in a newsroom where that would be allowed, but like on YouTube or some of these other places, you'll see people do wild things and then find out 3 months later they're being paid by some entity to do that. And that's why you have to be like really careful with the information you consume, I think.
We're going to turn to the audience here in just a moment, and want to again thank the Los Angeles World Affairs Council for assembling this important forum, and I want to send kudos to Jeff Baum and all of the leadership of the World Affairs Council here. And we're going to open up the floor to questions. I believe we may or may not have a microphone there, but let me. Sometimes the first question is slow in coming. So, is there a second question from the audience? Let's turn to the audience now. If you have any questions for me or the panelists here, at this point, we're going to open it up to questions and answers. Okay, go right ahead. Oh, very good. There's a question.
Thank you. Thank you. Hi, my name is Ines Girard. I'm from the International School of Los Angeles, and I wanted to ask, this goes for anyone, but specifically Mr. Mottek, because you mentioned your interest in health previously, but I wanted to ask what your opinions are on how the CDC has acted in recent months, I suppose, and how public health can affect our free speech and our democracy, and just how government institutions affect how we think about free speech and the First Amendment.
Well, again, depending on what station you watch, that's the take that you'll get. So that's why I flag that very carefully, that if you want to get a balanced view of things these days, don't just rely on one source and, draw your own conclusions once you get all of the facts so you can make an educated decision. As far as the pandemic is concerned, this was also an issue at that time, too, related to the vaccines and so forth. And that was also a very controversial time, and some people were deplatformed for speaking out against the vaccines and so forth. The pendulum was swung the other way as far as that's concerned. So we were told, to follow the science. It turned out to be, in some cases, political science, depending on what the political views are. So that's something that came out from that. But I think Professor Bellantoni, who's covering this from a more academic aspect could probably address it even more seriously. But my impression is, again, you have to rely on, don't just rely on one source for your information because of the politicalization that we're seeing these days.
It's also a question of access to the data. So I'll give you a couple examples here. So one of the things that the CDC has decided is it's not publishing information that used to be a really important source for journalists, right? Whether that's the numbers of people that have something or, vaccine, there's a whole, I've lost track of the things that they no longer put out. But in addition to that, I'll tell you right here at Annenberg, we've been struggling with this. We're a deep research institution and we have a lot of healthcare communication research that's going on. And the very beginning of the Trump administration this time, they unpublished all of the data sets or adjusted them so that there could only be one gender, male or two genders, male or female, in their data, which broke all of the research databases that our team was using to study health communication. Again, it's not political. They're not trying to prove a point. They're not reporting on it, but that access to information has changed. Or think about the way unemployment figures are reported once a month. Like when that is getting threatened, right? That's not a First Amendment issue, but it's, to me, troubling, and it just makes the urgency of what journalists do even more important. And finding out are there alternative ways to report this information? And if it has to be anecdotal, that's not really that great for anybody, but it's something. So on this issue, we actually have some mutual friends who worked in the Obama administration and then ended up being career employees working at the CDC. Many of them stormed out, quit in protest, or within various health agencies when actions started to happen in January. And they've started their own communication shop to be able to tell stories using, vaccine data and healthcare data and disease data and all of that. Like journalists, even though they're not journalists, they are political communicators and influencers is the wrong word here, but they're trying to influence public opinion. But they're not a journalist, but they're performing an act of getting this information out there, which is just, again, it's about all these lines being very blurred because it's the same skill sets.
One of the things that Christina and I literally talk about for work a lot is how do we bridge this moment we're in between mediums, like for young people. Like each of us see people in our lives who consume media differently than we did. And I presume that my parents felt the same way, that I took in media different ways. We're really in a moment where I think the most important thing to anchor on is the values and like kind of like the level of discernment that I was talking about. So one of the things I work with my students on is like, if you are going to go on, please don't go on TikTok for news, just in general, but like if you are, look for people who have the right journalistic values and where you can assess where they're getting their information from, how they're sharing it, because the distortion field there is just sort of like insane. And that's before you get to the fact that they're distilling everything into these, like, I don't know, how long is the average TikTok? Like 33 seconds or something? Like sometimes they're a minute, that's like for, your long reads version or whatever. But like, so I think that's like thing one, like we have to anchor on values. Thing two is it's incumbent upon people within the profession to innovate and create content that reaches readers who are used to taking it in this form. So one of the things we've been working on at USC is like, how do we teach that? How do we create a generation of journalism entrepreneurs who will really like sort of like attack the block and think about like grew up in this generation and know how that information is consumed? There's not like an easy solve for it, but I think that's how you get back to this place where when I was growing up, you definitely still had right-wing hacks and left-wing hacks and, libertarians and doing whatever libertarians do, but you do, which is often nothing, to be clear. But they're just neutral. You could have these organizations that felt like they were at least down the middle, kind of offering clear information. And that's certainly the way I came up. I worked at the Associated Press, which is a worldwide news service. And, the important thing also to remember is that these large neutral news organizations still make mistakes. But it's really about the values they're attempting to kind of like put forward there.
Let me just add one thing we haven't actually talked about yet. And it's funny because my boss has this line like, can you think how many minutes it's been since you've mentioned AI? Because it's in every conversation about everything we do now. And but we've noticed a lot in students that they rely on AI for like what I would call research, but what you're getting is not research. And sometimes one of the things that we see is a student will be interviewing somebody and they'll ask chat, what are the 5 questions I should ask Cynthia or Revo or whatever, right? And to me, that is a much bigger sort of sin in journalism than anything else, because what we're trying to teach you is to use your innate curiosity. What are you want to know? What are you curious about? All the things you bring to the table, your own background, your values, where you're from, the people you surround yourself with in your life, and again, how you're informed. I want you to bring that to your interview with this prominent person and think about it yourself. Or if you're researching, I want you to figure out what you find the most interesting about the person's background, not a non-human making that determination for you. So that sounds boring, or I'm like, oh, please use critical thinking. But actually, like, you can do that, and it's not that much faster. There's lots of ways that ChatGPT can make your life easier and faster, and that's the world we're in. That's fine. It's not the worst thing in the world. But the actual like making a judgment call or making decisions or using that thinking to like think about how you're going to interact with somebody, super important to try to develop that yourself. So if you have any interest in journalism, that's what I want you to be doing. To me, YouTube is, of all the technologies that exist, like that's the greatest one. You want to be a great interviewer? Go watch a bunch of great interviews of people you admire or journalists doing the interviews that you admire, right? Like you can learn a lot from that. Their styles, you can see which questions actually get answered, and depending on tactics and things like that, like you can study that in a way that like a non-human is not going to be able to tell you.
No substitute for real intelligence. That is good to hear. And no conference would be complete without bringing up AI, certainly. And nowadays, you don't even know if you're talking to a human being or not, or getting the news from a human being or not. That's how it is. And in fact, there are entire talk shows that are done with AI nowadays where the hosts are AI generated, for example. Newscasters now are not real. So be careful where you get your news from, folks. But you got the real deal here today. Anybody else in the audience for the next question? Another one right over here. Go right ahead.
Hi, my name is Nyla. I'm from Verdugo Hills High School, and my question is open to anyone, but I was wondering if there was a significant event or an experience you went through that led you to the career path or position that you're in today. Thank you.
Yeah. Significant life of forgive me if I screw up. Significant life event or experience that led you into your profession. Is that okay? That's a paraphrase, folks. I mentioned one for me, like when I was younger, my mom got sick, and then I saw her obituary in the newspaper, and it really made me want to be a writer and want to be able to tell people's stories. But I'll talk about why I wanted to become a political journalist, because I think that actually was a moment for me. I was like covering a city council in a relatively medium-sized city called Overland Park, and I just noticed something was like messed up with the budget. Like it didn't look right to me, and I realized that they had like spent an extra $8 million on like road sealant, which is the most boring topic in human history. But they were basically yeah, so you don't have potholes. But they were spending like double what they needed on it. And it just made me mad because I was like a taxpayer. And I was like, we should cover this better. And I went back to my newsroom at the Kansas City Star, and they were like, yeah, do it. And it just made me, like, I don't know, radicalize is not the right word, but it made me realize that public servants are like very fallible and need to be kind of covered with like a level of scrutiny. So
I'll tell it's kind of a sad story. In addition to what I said about the presidential election, there's a moment I don't think I realized it in the moment. It's so long ago now. It's been 22 years, but I teach it regularly, and I now reflect on it as like really a crystallizing moment about the type of person I think that I am and that drew me to the profession. And so I was covering a small town It was right before Thanksgiving. A bunch of the kids went to party, kind of an elite town in the Bay Area called Los Gatos. Very short version. Kids were drinking. Police came. Some kids got in cars. Some kids were running down the hill. One of the kids got in a car driven by somebody that was under the influence. Ultimately, that young man, they crashed, and this kid was in critical condition. And we knew that like the Wednesday night before Thanksgiving. And I was supposed to have Thanksgiving off, and my boss and I talked about it. My boss said, look, I need you to stay in touch with the police and the hospital and the family. And if this young man passes away, like I need you to go cover it for the Friday paper, because I'd already written things, but like that would be big news that this high school student had died. And that is exactly what happened. I sat down to my Thanksgiving dinner with my mom and my then significant other, and I got the call from the police sergeant. Really sorry to tell you, Eric Casada died today. And so I got up from the table and I went to his family's home, and I had to knock on their door. I was only 23 years old. And, nobody had taught me anything. I didn't learn it in school. I didn't actually study journalism, and I had never done anything like that before. And I just said what came to me as a human. And I said, I'm so sorry for your loss, and I would love to tell Eric's story. Are you willing to tell me about his life? Right? Just simple, clean, clear. And again, at the time, it was all just very stressful. And I wrote this story that I felt very proud of. And I had great pictures of him growing up. And I made this trauma bond with his mother. And then I covered the case pretty extensively. Looking back, I think I've learned two things. Like one, it's the knowing that I can go do that, go to someone in their darkest, most awful moment, the worst day of this woman's life, and be on her doorstep and say, please invite me in and let me talk to you, is hard to do. And it's not for everybody. And it's not what all journalism is. But even for our students who say, oh, I'll never have to do that because I'm a sports journalist. Like, people die in sports. And like, you will have to cover these types of things in your career, whatever you're covering, entertainment, whatever. And so knowing like that I could do that, and that I could do it, I think, in a way that was correct and with humanity and empathy and all of those things, and do it justice and care enough about doing it justice. And also later I realized like the people you're getting up from that table from, speaking about working nights and that kind of thing, they have to understand that you're drawn to this. And that's hard, right? I can't tell you how many Christmases, something happened and you end up having to work, or you're pulling out the laptop. And, it's one reason I teach and I'm not in an active newsroom now, because I have small children and it's much harder. But you need to surround yourself with people who, even if they don't love it that you're getting up from the Thanksgiving table, that they can understand why you're doing it, and that they will be there for you when you come home and you need to cry through it. Like I just had this horrible time where I had to talk to this mom about her dead son. So it took me a while to get that. And you're not really supposed to learn those lessons at a young age, but I think it's important to always kind of know what you're equipped for. And it's okay if it's not for you too. And recognizing that that's something our program tries to help students decide.
Thank you for that question. It's caused me to go back in time. I think my first exposure to news was probably around 4 years old. My mother was a bank teller back east, and her bank was robbed. And that afternoon, we went to a drugstore, and the newspapers had just been delivered, the afternoon newspapers in those days. They had another run, and I said, look, you're on the front page of the paper, talking to the FBI. My mother talking to the FBI on the front page of the newspaper. And so I thought, wow, that is really something. Fast forward to fourth grade, my teacher in those days, who was one of my favorites, encouraged the students to bring in a newspaper article every day and read it in front of the class, which was great. And the person that brought in the most articles got a day off at the library or something. It was a cute thing that she did. And as I mentioned, my interest in medicine caused me to volunteer at a hospital for several years, and it was very, very good training to work in the emergency room. You never knew what was going to come through that door. People died. You had to deal with all of that. And got a ringside seat to all of that. And had I gone into medicine, I probably would have become an emergency room doctor, because much like broadcasting, you have to do it right the first and only time when you're dealing with the situation. So thank you for that question.
That's why I went into print, because you can edit and write through.
There is a difference, right? Yes, go right ahead.
Hello, Bellantoni, Jackson, and Merak. I'm Yafi Gilazgi from the Health and Math and Science Academy. I want to talk back at the Jimmy Kimmel situation. He was taken off the air for Charlie Kirk's death and talking about how Republicans talked about it. But there was also this guy, Greg Stubfield, I think his name was. He said some things about Nazis on Fox News. He's like a host there, but he didn't receive any backlash. Is there anything we can do about that or something like that?
Yeah. So the short answer is of course. And I think CJ talked about that a little bit. It's the voting with your remote control, right? It's also organizing, right? If people are unhappy with something, they can write letters to networks, they can write letters to advertisers. Like you're talking about somebody that was on Fox News. You have seen several prominent Fox News people effectively be canceled because enough people complained to advertisers who then said, you're out. You know, it doesn't matter that we pay you $30 million a year, like you are not going to be on our airwaves anymore. Now, we are also in a moment where the people who might be offended by that comment about Nazis are perhaps less vocal or don't feel as empowered, particularly with the system of government right now. But consumers do have a lot of power. And I think they forget that sometimes. It's no different than, everybody's, Snoopy's having a resurgence. And so suddenly all the Charles Schultz, is making more money because everybody wants to buy a Snoopy thing. Like that's a voting with your pocketbook kind of thing. It is similar, whether that's, any form of entertainment. But we're also in a moment where it is inconsistent and people are not applying. There's a lot of hypocrisy. Even, I'll just tell a very brief story. I had somebody was complaining about a story the students did, and they were complaining about anonymity allowed in the story on the issue of Israel. And the students had provided anonymity to somebody who was saying, this is terrible, and they were protesting on campus. And the person complained about that who disagreed with the students, but did not note that 2 paragraphs down in that exact same story, there was an insult hurled at the protesters that was also anonymous. And I had to point out, like, if you're against the anonymity here, you have to be against it everywhere. And of course, the person didn't want to hear that. Like, it's hard for people to kind of see each other in that moment now. But your voice matters. And it's particularly when you have this platform where you can amplify it to the world.
The question was about hate speech. Correct me if I misstate this, but hate speech and should we put limits on hate speech? I think the answer, regrettably, and historically, is no. We shouldn't put limits on hate speech, but we should always call it out. Do everything we can to prevent it. Put values in our media ecosystem in our society where it's exactly where it should be. But the essence of the First Amendment and the way you protect people who have great information to share or important points of view to share is that you protect all of those folks. Now, there's a lot of, I'm not a lawyer, but there are lots of specific limitations on things you shouldn't do, shout fire in a crowded room or deliberately create incendiary environments. But the reality of kind of the constitutional situation and also kind of the way you get the best aspects of the First Amendment is that you have to protect everybody and you have to be pretty absolutist about it.
I agree.
And we have time for one more question in the center of the room. Right over there, yes.
Hello, my name is Madeline Hernandez. I'm from Verdugo Hills High School. And I was wondering, as students, were you guys ever silenced from speaking whatever, from covering something that was controversial? And do you think that in our modern time, we also have these things, these limitations in schools and in universities?
I love this question. Thank you for asking it. I think we heard it okay, so I don't need to repeat it. I will say, I was not a student journalist, but obviously I represent and mentor and work with a number of student journalists who we are paid. They're a student newsroom. The students who are paid in the newsroom, editors and producers, they're kind of leading things, and then there's students who are in classes who are producing the work. that's all done through the school, through USC, and that has never stopped them from reporting the very difficult, controversial things USC is doing. Just yesterday, my students published profiles of the 10 biggest political donors on the board of trustees of USC, something that had never been done. Nobody had ever added them up or shown, what these very powerful individuals had done. And we let USC know, we asked them for comment, but there's no prior restraint. There was no guide on that. And I'm the person who's always going to protect my students from that. And sometimes we break news about big mistakes or lawsuits or all kinds of things. And so that's never been an issue. I will point out there's an amazing organization called the Student Press Law Center, and it represents both college journalists and high school journalists. And I just went to they had a gala where they were honoring these high school journalists who were basically getting all of this pressure from their high school administration in Virginia because they had uncovered there was some problem with the way they were busing students that was unfair. And these students uncovered it, and the administration threatened to silence them. We're not going to allow you to print your newspaper. We're not going to pay for your website, that kind of a thing. And so they fought back. And then at the same time, there are some journalists in Eastern Texas. I'm forgetting the name of the school, but it's all on the Student Press Law Center website if you're interested. Same idea. The administration of the college didn't like the area of story that these students were pursuing, so it pulled their funding entirely. So the student didn't make any money anymore. The website was dead, and they had no print budget. And so these students started a Medium page and started fundraising. And now they're getting more attention than ever because the community rallied behind them with the support of the Student Press Law Center. So there are amazing resources. And I will say, if any of you are reporting on your own schools, don't back away. It is easy to be intimidated. We do see this at USC where students are like, oh, well, this is my school. Maybe I shouldn't be hard. You have every right to ask the questions and to look under, dark corners, and doesn't mean they're going to answer them. And you might have to work really hard, and you might get stonewalled every time, especially at a private university. But if there is truth to be told and information that is of news value, don't stop, and find somebody who might have some resources and people they can call that will help you. So that's a good segue. If anybody ever wants to get in touch, I didn't bring business cards, but my info is right on the USC Annenberg website. Happy to take emails, give you tours, come visit anytime.
Yeah, I would say same for me. I'm around not as often as Christina, but I can never be helped. I think the thing Christina hit on that is my shared experience is that I was a student journalist, and several times to establish my door credentials, I was the editor of my student newspaper at the University of Kansas. It's one of the oldest college newspapers. And 3 separate times when I was editor, the student senate at my university tried to cut funding that was crucial to the newspaper's day-to-day operations. And each time it was for something along the lines of we've reported that the Student Senate has tried to cut funding to, first it was the Black Student Union, and then another time it was First Nations Students Association. And basically you had a petulant student institution trying to cut funding from another willful student institution that wanted to cover them with the level of scrutiny that they deserve because they had control over budget for a bunch of student activities. I think the only takeaway from that is vote for a different KU Student Senate. That's one takeaway. But the other one is just show perseverance in these situations. Every time they threatened funding, and one time they kind of briefly succeeded, you just have to push through that. And that is the way that journalism works. That's the way the First Amendment works. That's the way you stop someone from putting hate speech into the air on Fox or any other type of hate speech on any other type of network. You really have to stick to your principles. So yeah, that was a great question.
For those of you who have been inspired today in the world of journalism, certainly the USC Annenberg Center for Journalism and Communication is the top in the United States as far as I'm concerned. So that was a very kind offer that you made, Professor Bellantoni, for the students to be in touch with you. And she means it, she said. And this is something that I mentioned in my news radio course. One of the texts that I used was Elements of Journalism. And right off the bat, you should know journalism's first obligation is to the truth. Good decision-making depends on people having reliable, accurate facts put in a meaningful context. Journalism does not pursue truth in an absolute or philosophical sense, but in a capacity that is more down to earth. That's an excellent introduction to journalism, elements of journalism. I also want to take note of the historic location that we're in, built for the 1932 Olympics, and then it was used in 1984 and will probably be used in 2028. So I feel very, very special to be at this historic spot here. And with that, I'm going to turn the program back over to the great leader of the LA World Affairs Council, Jeffrey Baum, to close us out. Yeah. Jeff Baum.
Important program. I'm going to ask Nick Boone to come up. Nick Boone is one of the leaders of the Boone Foundation, who makes this program possible, that we can bring students over and host programs like this around the city. And while Nick's coming up, will Brianna Bonfiglio stand up, please? There's Brianna. Brianna is a student at Golden Valley High School. She's the one that actually suggested today's topic. And I wanted students to know we are eager for feedback and suggestions. Krista Seitz, our program manager, interacts with all the faculty. And so let's give Brianna a hand for having a hand in making this possible.
So nice to be here. I'm always so encouraged hearing you very smart, wonderful young people asking very good questions to our smart panelists, and it just makes me feel so hopeful for the future. So thank you to the World Affairs Council and our wonderful panelists, and to all of you.
So happy holidays. We're going to make a presentation to each of our guests. In addition to USC Annenberg, which I also have an affiliation with, I do want you to know how many students work or write or have contributed to their school papers that are in the room, or student magazines or radio stations or anything like that. Keep it up. There are lots of great programs in journalism, not just at USC, but at Cal State Fullerton, Cal State Northridge, Cal State Long Beach, at the community college level that you're involved with. And we really encourage you to keep expressing yourselves and making your voices heard, because your generation is going to be the one that helps redeem all the problems that we left for you. So thank you, everybody. Safe travels home, and have a wonderful holiday season. Thank you.